Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Tuesday, May 27th, 2014. We're getting into the week. Just had a relaxing Memorial Day here. And for those of you who were wondering, our radio streams obviously are back up if you're listening to my voice here. And it seems the giant mutant hamster that was in the wire wheel, driving everything, passed away. So now we're having to get a new giant mutant hamster. And we got a regular hamster, and we're feeding him GMO corn just as fast as we can to bulk him up here. And we gave the last giant mutant hamster proper and honorable burial, basically the way the VA would handle it. We just threw him down the garbage disposal. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Now, obviously, the situation in Ukraine continues to dominate our awareness at this point. With most of the ballots counted, it's pretty much assumed that Petro Poroshenko is Ukraine's new president, a juntist selected by the other juntists and elected into power with an election with rampant and obvious vote fraud. They found computer malware in the central computer that was counting all the votes. That forced a hand count. We showed a photo. We linked it to the front of our website of these transparent ballot boxes with neatly folded stacks of ballots already inside on the bottom. There is no way this thing is legitimate. Of course, the U.S. government is saying, yes, it's democracy in action. Our government we installed by force has just voted itself back into power, and that makes it legitimate. No, it doesn't. It's a fraud. It's a gigantic fraud here. The violence is continuing all over Ukraine, and it looks like it's just going to flash up even worse. Now, one of Poroshenko's opponents in the presidential election has come out and said flat out, Poroshenko is taking all of his instructions from Washington, D.C. And this fits precisely the outcome that was in that leaked telephone conversation between U.S. Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to the Ukraine Piotr. The idea was for Poroshenko to be put into power as the new president and then to basically obey whatever Washington, D.C. tells him to do, which is to loot the Ukrainian people for the benefit of the private central banks and to provoke conflict with Russia. And it looks like he's going to do that. Now, Poroshenko is already out there saying that Ukraine is not going to become another Somalia. He's not going to allow it to deteriorate into outright civil war. We are already getting documentation from people on social media in eastern Ukraine that the Ukrainian forces and the hired mercenaries are now targeting civilians, non-combatants. They're shelling buildings like schools. They attacked the airport the other day, and it is a major, major confrontation. The part that everybody needs to be really alarmed about, and this was reported over in Press TV, Poroshenko is saying he will return Crimea to Ukraine. That means he wants a war with Russia. And now that Ukraine is going to join with NATO, that's the big war on the horizon. And the U.S. is supporting him and backing him because, by golly, they need a war to take everybody's mind off of the mismanagement of this country and the economy. And, of course, Poroshenko is now asking for direct U.S. military aid. So dig into those pockets, folks, because your tax dollars are not going to go to the road, schools, and hospitals and the hungry in this country. You're going to be buying more bullets, more bombs, more warplanes to go over and start another war over there in Ukraine. I don't think Russia can politically back down and say, okay, you can have Ukraine back. Now, President Poroshenko was already talking about scrapping the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which basically said in exchange for joining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and not obtaining nuclear arms, Russia agreed not to intrude into Ukraine, and the West agreed not to try and take advantage of the situation economically, which, of course, they've done. The West is already in violation of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And what is really alarming is by scrapping this memorandum, Poroshenko is sending a message that he will now allow nuclear weapons of mass destruction to be deployed in Ukraine. And Russia's not going to be very happy about that either. These war hawks, they want their war. They've already got their bunkers. They got lots of bunkers. You paid for them. You'll not be allowed inside, but they've got their bunkers already set up. So if they make a really bad mistake, they'll just go underground for a year or two and come back up. And wow, look at all the room without all those useless eaters walking around here. Just one gigantic park, Garden of Eden across the globe, and we own it because we got rid of all those other people. A reminder that this whole thing is economically motivated. Vice President Joe Biden's son and John Kerry's stepson are both now on the board of the Ukrainian State Petroleum Company after the U.S. financed a coup d'etat to overthrow the democratically elected pro-Russian president. This is obvious, and I don't think anybody around the world is falling for any of the propaganda coming out of Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, Nicolas Sarkozy is dealing with another corruption scandal as the head of his party has now had to resign over £9 million worth of fake invoices. It doesn't seem like there's anybody with any kind of honor or morals or ethics anywhere in the political system. You know, evil's an exclusive club. They don't want good people in there. It makes them all look bad. That's why they gave Cynthia McKinney and Ron Paul the heave-ho. Can't have them in here. They make us look bad. They show us up. But the net result of the European Union elections, it's been a major setback to the globalists and unionists. It, in fact, was an outright kneecapping. And everybody's trying to make excuses over there in Brussels. They're just dealing with this flurry of election victories by the Eurosceptic parties all across Europe. And they're trying to figure out some way saying, well, no, this is not a rejection of the European Union. There's something else going on. And they're suggesting maybe we got just a little draconian in how we're abusing the people, and maybe we need to kind of back off. The corporate media in Europe, especially in Great Britain, they're just pounding on Nigel Farage and the UKIP party. They're just a classic case of sour grapes. They lost the election by a huge margin, and they're out there saying, this is a wrong direction. We must do something about, this is too important to leave to the voters, which is always the harbinger of extreme skullduggery by the government. Tony Blair has come out of his retirement to basically saying, we shouldn't be bothered about migration. Really, it's not that much of an issue, and Europe is our friend. And he's out there. He made a comment about how the EU was dominated by anti-immigrant feeling and a desire to get Britain out of Europe, which is certainly true enough. And he said, these are not answers to what's happening in the world. And I have to agree with Tony Blair. He's right on this one. The answer to what is happening all over the world right now is to shut down the private central banks loaning the public currency at interest. That is the root of all the evils we are dealing with right now. So Blair went on to launch an attack on UKIP, calling them nasty and unpleasant. I'm kind of half expecting him to talk about how ugly their dogs are and their mother dresses them funny. And, of course, Blair is encouraging Miliband to stand up to Farage. And what's really interesting, this article's over in the Daily Mail. Reading the comments, it is very obvious that this election result has absolutely gelled opposition to the European Union. And it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Everybody in the European Union is seeing their economies be destroyed by that European Central Bank, and they want it to stop. So it's going to be a hard fight for the money junkies to stay in control of the European Union, just like it's getting to be a hard fight to stay in control of the United States against growing opposition here. We have to take a break for some commercials. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, I'm hearing an echo coming back to me now from the control room. Okay. We seem to be having some technical issues today. Okay, the echo's gone. Now, getting on back to the European Union elections. France's Hollande is now calling for reform of remote European Union. Now, he seems to be responding a little more pragmatically to the major setback to the globalist agenda from these recent elections and saying maybe it's time for the EU to scale back its power and allow the individual nations to have more autonomy, which, of course, the EU is not going to allow. They want all the power and control in their halls, just like the federal government wants all the power and control inside Washington, D.C. Autonomy for the states and the people. What do you think this is, a republic, a democracy, or anything like that? And Holland is basically saying that they do have to pay attention to the economy, not in terms of how well it is for the money junkies, because it's really great for them, but it's time to start really paying attention to the fact that they have a very unhappy population all across Europe that vastly outnumbers those European Union politicians. Now, going the other extreme here, David Cameron has come out and said it's time to extend the European Union into Asia. This is the next step. The globalists are there. We're going to grab it all. It's all going to come under our global union. And I think looking at what the European Union has done to life in Europe is the single greatest argument against allowing any more of these large regional unions to form, let alone a single one-world government devoted to serving the private central bankers. We cannot allow that to happen, or we condemn all future generations of humanity to permanent debt servitude. They're trying to bring back feudalism and serfdom, where you are born into slavery, you spend your entire life paying rent to their lordships and ladyships, and then you die, and that's it. That's what your life, that's the life they want you to have. They absolutely hate this idea of individual people owning the land that they live on or having control over their own money. That's not the way they see the world. They see the world where the banks issue all the money, and through the money they control the world. Remember that video of Alan Greenspan saying the Federal Reserve is answerable to no federal government authority. They see themselves as above the law. They see themselves as the de facto rulers of the United States of America and any place else where the dollar is reigning supreme. Now, getting on down to Syria, it is looking more and more like the U.S. is going to attempt something dramatic ahead of this coming Syrian elections, because it looks like Bashar al-Assad is going to win re-election. And if that happens, it completely undermines the entire U.S. justification for being in Syria for the last 3 years, which is that the Syrian people hate Assad, and that justifies military intervention to go on in and take him out and put in a U.S.-friendly government. Right now, looking at the polls, the American people absolutely do not like or trust the U.S. Congress or the President of the United States. Does that justify another country militarily intervening to overthrow that government and put in a regime friendly to them? Of course not. It's absurd. It's just another excuse for conquest and imperial designs here. Meanwhile, Obama is now talking about sending U.S. military advisors to Syria. No, we don't have troops on the ground. They're not in combat. They're advisors, which is exactly how we got into Vietnam. We were sending the advisors, and then when the North Vietnamese attacked the advisors, of course they had to fight back. That's how we got into Vietnam, with the advisors. We are advising this country. Meanwhile, Obama made a reference to this during his surprise visit to the troops in Afghanistan, but it's now being confirmed by a White House spokeslug. Obama will keep nearly 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan after December, despite his promise during the State of the Union speech to have all U.S. troops out by the end of this year, and despite his 2008 campaign promise to end the wars and bring the kids home. Oh, my goodness, he lied to us again. And how much longer are you going to sit there with a government that lies to you about absolutely everything, to get your money, to get your labor, to get your obedience, to get your children to send off in these wars of conquest? When is enough enough? When are you going to stand up and say, I will have a truthful government, or I will have no government at all? It is time. We're going to grab some phone calls here. Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the European Union. Basically, it was set up. It's a big scam. Look at how each country falls apart, and they got to take from either their own country or another country in the European Union to keep the other country going while they're taking away from their country. It's falling apart because they just can't keep this scam going. You can tell.
Yeah, it is. And it's all because of that private central bank, which by design creates more debt than money with which to pay the debt. And the debt grows and grows and grows, and the bankers use that debt to control the governments and to take the real assets, the real wealth of the country. Like down in Greece, the government of Greece has now been forced to sell off 110 of their public beaches to private developers. It is a scam. And every politician who sold their people into that slavery ought to be tarred, feathered, hanged, drawn, quartered, burned, and the ashes peed on by a rabid wombat.
Yeah, I think that, did you see that on ETF Daily News about Western central banks are running out of gold? When the gold goes east, that's it. Like all the power is shifting to the east, you can tell. This is like a last-ditch attempt by the West to keep something going. You can feel it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. The U.S. government got lazy. Wall Street got lazy. They were growing rich off of taking a piece of the action of all global commerce through that dollar as the global currency, and they neglected manufacturing. They neglected new technology and product development. They allowed Monsanto to absolutely destroy America's agricultural exports with this GMO experiment. And now they're in a corner. It's either let it collapse or start a world war and conquer everything, and that's what they're trying to do.
I think they're going to let it collapse. I was thinking about Independence Day, where when the aliens came to invade Earth, They basically would go to planet, sucking them dry. That's why I think we have no manufacturing here is just because the bankers, they used up us. We're all used up. We're a consumption country. So now they're moving on everything. They moved everything to China. And now that's going to be with Russia, with the power Eurasian area, and we're just going to be left to, like Greece.
Well, you're absolutely right. Private central banking is a predatory system. That's why when the United States was started, it was absolutely forbidden, and we went with a then revolutionary idea of a government-issued value-based currency that was coined by the U.S. government, spent into circulation to buy what the government needed. It flowed through commerce without accruing interest to the private central bank and then was taxed back by the same amount at the end of the cycle to balance the books. And it is a system that works for the nation and for the people. Public currency as a public utility. But those private central bankers can't stand that. In fact, if you look in my article, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, about the editorials that were written when Lincoln started issuing the greenback, and how absolutely horrified the bankers were about a government creating its own money, that cannot be allowed. And it is a predatory system. The bankers don't create anything. They just siphon off wealth from the planet with this ink and paper scam that they've been running for hundreds and hundreds of years. We have to take a break for commercials. Dustin, we're going to let you go. More phone calls when we come back from these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones here. Shannon in Tennessee. Aloha, Shannon. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Mike. I've heard you talk before about this globalization stuff, and I've heard you say that you'd like to see the planet split up into 2,000 plus size little small nations, and I agree with you, except instead of 2,000, I'd like to see about 5,000 or 6,000, so that way every one of these little size countries is going to be the right size to where if there's a problem, the politicians are not going to be so far away that we can't get a hold of them if we have to.
There is merit in your idea.
And it makes me feel good to see some of these secession movements over in Europe, like Catalonia, Venice, and I've heard, other people talking about, other places besides the ones in the United States, but these nations need to be no more than a few hundred to a few thousand square miles in size with no more than a few million population, so that way that if people had to walk, that it be within a couple of 3 days walk to go and string up their politicians. And that's all I got to say.
Well, the other advantage is, of course, that if all the nations are just really small, it makes it very difficult for one to try and build a global empire. We do need to be on guard against that. There still needs to be some kind of an organization all the nations of the world belong to automatically. It's like, a homeowners association for the planet, so that when any one nation starts behaving abominably, like the United States, or for that matter, Israel, the rest of the world can unite against them and say, hey, it's time for you to learn how to get along with your neighbors. Okay, and stop thinking that your imaginary playmate in the sky gave you more right to the blessings of life than everybody else around you, because that is absolutely not the way it's supposed to be working. Shannon, we're going to let you go and switch over to Mike in Kentucky. Aloha, Mike. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, I was going to talk about the Sir Richard Body's book and how he, kind of did a memoir of his years in Parliament. But right when I was talking to the producer, a whole bunch of channels went down on the IA5 97-degree west satellite, including you guys' including your, and they were down for about 5 minutes or something. Russia Today was the only service that I could find on there, like the Pastor Scott and some of the other channels went down along with you guys in the other.
Over the weekend, the American Classic Movies channel out here in Hawaii locked up for almost an entire day. There was nothing coming through there. And, of course, we had our little whoopsie yesterday with our streaming servers. It's either somebody's out there running tests to see how to shut down the independent media for the next big false flag, or it's just a symptom of the fact that our entire infrastructure is rotting away from neglect.
That plus everything's trying to go to this digital convergence paradigm shift with no analog backup. It'd be nice to have a workaround.
It would be nice to have a backup. I remember when they went to over-the-air digital here in Hawaii, and all the analog sets stopped working. I had this little portable TV that I'd use to get the camera feed while I was working on Lost, and it's digital capable, but I can't pick up a digital signal that will decode where I live. The signal is just too weak and it is too much interfered with. It's really not a workable system. And in
a lot of places, it's not. There's a lot of places that have way more channels than they ever had. If you're nice, an open country with not a lot of trees and stuff in the way, you've got 35 channels or something, where you used to have 3 or 4.
Well, that's a good thing to have too. But again, it's not really working all that well here.
Yeah, and what a lot of people discovered, and I'm not just talking about television, but the concrete jungle reflects the signals around, and that reflected signal you could still watch on analog, but in digital it locks it up.
Yeah, it's the multipath problem. It's definitely the multipath problem.
The CIA was, according to Richard Body's book, England for the English, I think was the name of the book. The CIA was intimately involved in making sure Britain joined the European Union back in the early 70s, which is way before most people even knew that they were pushing for a European Union. And, of course, I talked with a banker in Florida. None of your money stays in the bank. In the early 80s, he saw some of the shenanigans going on with Don Johnson, Miami Vice type stuff, where people would come in and they'd throw a bunch of money in the bank and it would immediately go to euro dollars to be invested there. And I have to wonder about this whole situation if the unrest is not being fomented by those that are strategically invested, like the CIA, because we know they're always out there doing insider deals and trades with In-Q-Tel or whoever to incubate stuff, but and of course end up selling them both sides, the missiles and the bullets.
Very much so. It's a game the U.S. has been playing all along. Israel plays it as well. Get two countries into war and then start selling weapons to both sides. In fact, it's sort of a common feature of defense contractors and weapons providers is to always try and start a war someplace because it's always good for business. In fact, one of D. McLachlan's books had that very topic in the storyline about this guy who has a gun factory and he goes out and he starts wars to make money. And I think that's a good lesson for children to have.
Good for business.
Yeah, good for business.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully whatever gremlins has been going on there, you guys will avoid any more. That was a little spooky yesterday. So.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of weird. It went right down the middle of my show. There's a lot of bad behavior going on out there. In fact, a little later in the show, we've got a new report. There's apparently a ransomware problem hitting Apple devices. And, of course, the NSA can't find who these guys are. And, of course, this should put to rest this idea that Apple products are somehow immune to cyber criminals. This proves no, they're not. There are now enough Apple products out there, iPhones, tablets, and whatnot, where the cyber criminals can make money off of them. And because they are not battle hardened for computer security the way the Windows users are, they're basically babes in the wood, and it's just open season on those Apple users. All right, Mike, we're going to let you go here. I want to get back to the international news. Mark Glenn is reporting over at Press TV, Egypt's Sisi to protect Israel and U.S. interests. Now, basically, they're talking about Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. He's a presidential candidate for Egypt, and they're basically, Press TV is saying that he has been installed in Egypt to safeguard the interests of the United States and Israel, just as Poroshenko was installed as the new president of Ukraine to protect U.S. interests there. It's the same game the U.S. has been playing all along. The Egyptian revolution kicked out the corrupt Mubarak. They voted Morsi in, despite massive vote fraud against him. Morsi was standing up to the U.S. and Israel, so they start a counter-revolution to kick him out. Now they're positioning pro-Western puppets to be the new president of Egypt. They're still playing that game. Meanwhile, out in the Pacific, the situation there is escalating. China is reported to have now attacked and sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel. Now, this was an extraordinarily reckless thing to happen. Now, they're calling it an attack, but apparently what happened is the Chinese ship rammed the Vietnamese fishing vessel. There's been a lot of bumping going along, but apparently this bump was a little bit harder, stove in the hull of the fishing vessel, and the boat sank. Now, the 10 fishermen on the boat have been rescued. It is still an escalation of the tension that's going on over there. And all of this is kicked up by the U.S. The U.S. is telling Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, go for it, push, 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 go for it, push. We'll protect you. We'll give you weapons if it goes ugly. Meanwhile, as we reported yesterday, Turkey's highest court has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli commandos who were in charge of the attack on the Mavi Marmara, the humanitarian aid ship that Israel attacked. They killed 8 people, including a U.S. citizen, which drew absolutely no protest at all from the U.S. government. Turkey has now asked Interpol to put out an international arrest warrant for these fugitives as well. So if these Israeli commandos, and apparently some of them are high-ranking officers, if they should wander into Turkey or any country Turkey has an extradition treaty with, or any country where Interpol has jurisdiction, they can be arrested and sent either to Turkey or to the International Criminal Court. All righty, we're coming up here on another commercial break. When we come back, there's still wagging Flight 370 in the news here. A lot of information being shoved back and forth, a lot of noise, a lot of fluff, a lot of dust. We'll try and sort it out when we come back from these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And on the media right now, Obama is out there trying to basically whitewash the fact that he broke his promise in the State of the Union address to have all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan by the end of the year. And he's out there praising the men for the sacrifice they've made to this very grateful nation. They're not grateful. Afghanistan wants us gone. Hamid Karzai wouldn't even meet with Obama when he went out there over the weekend. The man's just up there and doing his Pinocchio impression. Can't even stand to watch the guy any longer. Alrighty, so there's a new development in Malaysia Flight 370 where some of the satellite data has been released. And according to this report from CNN, which is still obsessing about Flight 370, they requested the relatives of the passengers wanted the raw data so they could double-check the official story. And apparently the data that has been released has large gaps in it And it's missing those elements that would allow outside experts to check the official story. The cover-up is continuing. Now, for those of you who have not been following along, there were three basic theories about what happened to Flight 370. The first is it was hijacked to be stripped for parts. There is a global shortage of 777 parts around the world, and carefully dismantled that aircraft would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The second theory is that the plane was hijacked to be used for some kind of a false flag attack flown to Diego Garcia. And the third theory, which has come out in a recent book, based on eyewitnesses on an oil platform that saw the plane falling out of the sky right after the transponder contact was lost. The latest theory is that it was a victim of an accidental shoot-down from a joint American-Thai military exercise going on in the area at the time. Now, we know the United States of America, for all the money they put into their weapon systems, they're not producing very good, reliable systems. We know it was a software error that led to the USS Vincennes accidentally shooting down an Iranian Airbus. Similar computer error appears to have been behind the U.S. Navy's accidental shoot-down of TWA-800 off the coast of Long Island. And it looks like they haven't learned from their past mistakes, and it's happened again. And I'm leaning more and more to that third theory as most likely what happened. And all this other stuff about it flew west, it flew here, it was down in the South Indian Ocean was just all propaganda to keep us from looking at the surface of the ocean right where the transponder quit working. And for those private satellite companies that have been putting up images on crowdsourcing websites for people to search for the debris, you need to go back and get the images of the surface of the ocean right around the area where the transponder quit, and you need to put those up so we can take a look at what's going on. And if they don't put those images up, it means they got a phone call from somebody saying, don't you do that. Don't you do that. But it is not beyond the realm of possibility that the U.S. military has once again shot down a passenger airliner by mistake and lacked the manliness to stand up and say, our bad, we're sorry. Apparently, we're getting back to the Veterans Administration scandal. Apparently, there was a veteran in California who just got very upset waiting 4 hours for dialysis at the VA hospital in Loma Linda. And he basically said he was just going to go home until they called him, and he was going to leave the little needle in the arm so they wouldn't have to put in a new one. The nursing staff called the VA police department, and the officers stopped this veteran, and they basically beat him to a pulp. They tackled him to the floor. This is a U.S. veteran suffering from kidney failure. They slammed his head into the ground, stomping on his neck, and he suffered a stroke. So those of you young people thinking of joining the military, this is how you'll be treated after you're wounded and no longer useful to the war machine. Meanwhile, there's another story coming out of California that those veterans being treated in the hospitals who die are not being buried. And apparently there are something like 60 deceased U.S. veterans just stored in a vault at the L.A. County morgue who died in the care of the Veterans Administration, and the Veterans Administration doesn't want to pay to bury them, so they're just stacking them up in the room. Now, the gun grabbers are going ballistic over this mass death incident that took place out in Santa Barbara. And we are continuing to see these videos reporting that there were 2 people in the BMW from which the gunfire came. And it's beginning to look more and more like this is another Boston Marathon bombing or another Sandy Hook or another Columbine. It's a staged incident to push the anti-gun agenda. And I grieve for all the people who died in this attack, especially because they died for a fraud. But the issue here, even if you accept the official story, we're dealing with a kid who was being treated for mental illness, had been on prescription antidepressants and had stopped taking them, which is the time when you are most at risk for an episode of violence and suicide. But we've got multiple eyewitnesses saying there were two people in the shooter's car. The kid himself was driving, and there was a second person in the passenger seat doing the shooting. And it looks like they just probably NSA found this kid scanning all of the internet traffic. They got his videos in his manifesto and said, oh, this guy'd make a perfect patsy for another gun crime scenario. So they got to him. They said, you drive, I'll shoot, we'll have fun. And then the guy in the passenger seat shoots the kid at the driver's wheel and leaves him to cement the story in place. But there's no reason at all to buy the original story, because remember, half of the deaths came from knives and stabbing. But the gun grabbers are out there. It's the NRA's fault. We've got to take the guns away. How many more children do we have to kill? I mean, how many more children do have to die before we will convince Americans that they don't need guns? I mean, just look throughout history at all those countries where the people didn't have guns and only the government had guns, like the former Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And look how well that worked out. I'm smelling panic in Washington, D.C. I think they understand they've lost the faith and trust of the American people, and they're desperate to find some way to get it back, or alternatively, to shut down the internet and the independent media and get everybody trooping loyally back to get their daily dose of propaganda from the corporate TV news media. Meanwhile, George Soros is telling America to get your money out of the banks before it is too late. And that's the same thing we've been saying here on our radio show. You should only have as much money in the bank as you need to cover your immediate obligations. Take the rest out, keep some of it as cash, keep some of it as physical silver and gold. And now Soros is saying pretty much the same thing, because we're already hearing Janet Yellen is talking about negative interest on savings account. They're talking about bailouts and bail-ins all across Europe now. What they did in Cyprus, they're now getting ready to go do all across every nation with a private central bank. Loot the people to keep that Ponzi scheme going just a little bit longer. Now, an article coming out of Kitco is saying that the rising Asian GDP per capita, they're doing very well over there, could trade gold higher. There's a huge demand for gold in China. China's government is actively encouraging their people to invest in physical metals. And I think at this point it's almost inevitable we will see the U.S. government confiscate physical gold and silver from the American people. They did it once before in 1933. And they'll give you a big stack of that ink and paper stuff in exchange for it. But, of course, that ink and paper stuff is just being printed up on the fly, and it's losing value all over the place. Meanwhile, interesting story out of One World Trade Center. They just have the dedication of the museum. The new replacement World Trade Center is there. It's the new bright spot on the skyline here. Nobody wants to rent offices there. It's not the big draw people thought it was going to be. They've already had to lower their rent rates by 10%. There just aren't enough businesses there willing to rent in that building. And I think that's probably true all across the country. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. And I'm looking at the corporate media, and they're wagging Boko Haram in Nigeria at us again to try and get Americans to say, yes, let's invade yet another African nation that's full of resources. We're actually in World War III. I don't think there's any denying it anymore. I think the U.S. government realized they weren't going to be able to sell a world war to the American people because they didn't have a convenient enemy that made any kind of a sense. And I think they were just sort of doing it with covert overthrows and coups d'etats, and they're just sort of trying to sneak it past us. But at this point, yeah, we're in a world war. U.S. military doctrine says when you have multiple fronts on multiple continents, it is a world war. And the United States is already has invaded countries in the Middle East. It's invaded countries in Africa. It's trying to start a war with China out in the Western Pacific. We're in World War III. We are in World War III. And I fear the United States is going to lose it, even if it does go nuclear, which I think is kind of inevitable. We're going to take a phone call. Tyler in Tennessee. Aloha, Tyler. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How's it going? I just had I'll ask the question and hang up and listen. But it's kind of two things. What angle do you think Soros is running at on warning people to take the money out of the banks and everything, because he's working an angle.
Well, I know he works a lot of angles, but we also know he's been liquidating a lot of his stock portfolio, and I think basically, he's being asked these questions by various reporters, and he's saying basically the same thing that everybody else is. The banks are not a safe place for your money. We saw that in Cyprus. We're seeing it in Greece. They're talking about bail-ins all over Europe. The current fiscal plan for Canada includes an option in emergencies to bail in from the savings accounts of Canadians. And they're looking at a way to try and bring it here. Like I said before, Janet Yellen is talking about negative interest rates on savings. Very obviously, the agenda of the private central banks is, if they can't keep their Ponzi scheme going any longer, to just outright engage in looting of the people, rob the poor to give to the rich. That's where we are right now, the reverse Robin Hood.
And wouldn't he be involved in some portion of that, or initiating something to help that happen?
At this point, it looks to me like he's delinking. He's getting out. Because he's an investor, he's not a banker. And he's there's a little bit of a difference there. The bankers are making out great, but more and more the small investors have all been crushed. The mid-level investors are in trouble, and I think Soros sees the writing on the wall that as the foundation of this pyramid collapsed, the cracks are starting to move up higher and higher in the economic food chain, as it were, and he wants to basically get disconnected from the system before those cracks reach him.
When you see him sell off from the dollar or something like that, that'd be the time to think.
Yeah, definitely. But we're seeing a lot of Wall Street CEOs are very quietly liquidating their stock portfolios. At this point, there really is no way to hold this system together, especially if the BRICS nations en masse drop the dollar. It's going to happen real fast.
Okay, thanks, Mike. You have a good one.
All right, thanks an awful lot here. Okay, so far for the first quarter of 2014, states across the country are reporting a fall in tax revenues. Ohio down 19%, California 11%. And basically what it means is commerce is drying up. People aren't buying things, which means they're not paying sales tax. They're cutting back on their drinking, which means they're not paying alcohol tax, or they're going to the moonshiners. And it's all falling. And all of these states had budget predictions that were based on the official U.S. government unemployment numbers of 6%. And that was for political reasons. You don't dare stand up in a state government and accuse the federal government of cooking the books for the unemployment numbers, even though we know that's exactly what they've been doing. So their budgetary forecasts were unrealistic going in. And they're in trouble. So, now, apparently the Justice Department 4 years ago began or made public an investigation into auto parts price fixing. And this impacts not only weekend mechanics who are trying to keep their old cars running again, but even new car manufacturers who obtain many of the parts for their cars from these auto parts companies were being affected. And basically they're saying that the cost to U.S. drivers is millions of dollars in extra costs that really weren't justified. There's supposed to be a competitive marketplace. Put out a good product at the lowest price, people will come to you. And these auto parts companies were colluding to raise their prices and say, we're all going to agree to sell air conditioning compressors for $1,000 instead of $200. So far, 34 individuals have been charged. 27 companies have pled guilty or are about to do so. This was a nationwide scandal that cost you, the American driver, a lot of money you did not really need to pay. Now, of course, the Justice Department is touting this investigation as proof they're doing their job, even as they continue to ignore the far more lucrative frauds taking place on Wall Street. Meanwhile, Senator Harry Reid out there in Nevada is out there saying that the way to save the U.S. economy is to bring in the illegal aliens. Drop the borders, let them come on in. It's going to be a job creator. Like a flood of new illegal aliens is going to improve the job market for Americans? Of course not. part of that New World Order agenda. All the nations have all the same mix of ethnic people, so we can drop the borders. Everybody has to be driven down to the same poverty as the third world nations so they can drop the borders for their New World Order. Now, Austria has notified the Bank of England that they want to verify their gold bullion stored in the vaults at the Bank of England. Now, this is seen as a response to growing public pressure inside Austria over doubts about whether the gold is really there. So a delegation is going to be sent to London to go into the vaults and take a peek. Now, remember, when Germany wanted to inspect their gold at the Bank of England, Bank of France, and New York Federal Reserve, they were told, no, you can't look at it, and we're not set up to handle tourists. So I don't know what they're going to do at the Bank of England. Maybe there's a cargo plane full of gold bars already on the way from the New York Federal Reserve to London, so they can pile it up in the closet and say, Austria, there's your gold, slam the door and send them home. But what's really going to be interesting is when all of these countries that have gold bullion on deposit at these central bullion banks demand an audit at the exact same time, and then they're not going to be able to continue the fraud. Article over at ETF Daily News. In fact, one of the callers reported it on it earlier. The Western central banks are running out of gold. And they're talking about this options trader, Daniel Plunkett at Barclays, was the first person to be fined by Britain's financial watchdog for manipulating the price of gold. We've been saying for years they're trying to artificially keep the price of gold down, to keep you in your savings account, keep you in your stock portfolio, to make it possible for these bullion banks to buy up physical gold at rock bottom prices. And now that is starting to come apart. The London gold fix will be ending this summer. I'm sorry, that's the silver fix I may be talking about. Yeah, it's the silver fix, but the gold fix is not far behind. People who are investing, they don't want to know that the system is rigged against them, and yet it really is. Meanwhile, China is launching a global gold exchange in Shanghai. And I'll bet you the New York Federal Reserve is going to be the first people pounding on the door and saying, we need some bullion quick. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show and listening to that bump music. Yesterday we reported on how the Anti-Defamation League in its own promotional materials is now bragging about how they are training U.S. police forces. So if you were wondering why the American police are treating the American people the way the IDF treats the Palestinians, there it is. There's the reason. Meanwhile, the U.S. House has approved an additional $600 million in military aid for Israel, which is basically being sent on this idea that the U.S. has to pay for Israel to develop their Iron Dome missile system and their David Sling and Arrow 3 missile programs. Israel doesn't want to pay for their own weapons development, so you, of course, have to. And the money is justified over the idea that the U.S. is committed to Israel maintaining a qualitative edge in weaponry over their neighbors. The problem with that being that as soon as Israel develops a new weapon system, they sell it to all their neighbors. Then they turn around to the U.S. and say, look, they got the same weapons we do. We need more money to develop a qualitative edge. And it's just another scam to strip mine the wealth of the American people for Israel. Now, over at gaschamberhoax.com, they have an article taking a serious look at what's being called the Treblinka archaeology hoax. And they're talking about this British archaeologist, Carolyn Sturdy Coles, who did this so-called investigation of Treblinka and basically came out and said absolutely everything that you were told about Treblinka is true. And they've exposed some of the fraudulent tactics she used, such as digging in a Christian graveyard, saying it was a new hidden mass grave, claiming that showers are gas chambers and all kinds of stuff like that. Now, the reason this became an issue is not too long ago, researchers conducted a survey of the entire Treblinka site with ground-penetrating radar trying to locate all the mass graves that the Orthodox account of World War II says should be there. And they didn't find them. And in fact, what the ground-penetrating radar showed is the underground strata was undisturbed. since the last ice age, meaning the graves weren't there, then dug up and taken someplace else. There was no sign of mass excavations where these places were supposed to be. So they quickly funded this Carolyn Sturdy Calls to basically come in and say, oh, no, pay no attention to the ground-penetrating radar. I found bodies in this Christian graveyard and the rest of it. And it's another hoax, trying to prop up that official narrative in a very, very skeptical, increasingly skeptical world. Now, getting on to the world of computers, and apparently Glenn Greenwald is getting ready to publish another bombshell article in which he will have a list of names of some of the Americans being spied on by the National Security Administration. All without warrants, all in violation of the Fourth Amendment, all to keep an eye on us to make sure we're not thinking those double plus ungood thoughts. And he's going to be publishing that. Now, over in China, first it was Cisco, then Microsoft products, now it's IBM. China has ordered all of their banks to remove their high-end IBM servers out of a concern that they are backdoored by the NSA and that the NSA could launch some kind of a cyber attack on China's economic system. Now, if you are owning and using any Apple device or Macintosh, you may be targeted by hackers who are engaged in what's called ransomware. You go into your iPhone, your iPad, your desktop Mac, whatever, and all of a sudden the machine is locked, and there's a statement saying that you have to send so much money through PayPal in order to get your machine unlocked. Now, according to Apple, who have not commented on exactly how this hack is being done, there is a way to reset your password and get your machine back without paying the ransom. A little bit of jumping through hoops to do it, but it is out there. This attack appears to be coming through Apple's iCloud, and it's linked to your Apple ID. So the one recommendation they're getting is that if you have an Apple account, that means iTunes, any of those services, change your Apple ID password right now. Now, there are two implications of this story. The first one is that Apple products are not somehow safer from hackers than Windows machines. It's just up until recently there weren't enough of them to make it financially rewarding to go out and do hacks. Now there are. And all those Apple users who've gone on for years and years just automatically believing that their machines were somehow immune to viruses, they're rather naive about computer security. They're not battle-hardened veterans like those of us working on the Windows platform. And it's going to get very ugly. And, of course, the second implication of this is the NSA, which watches us all, can't catch these guys. Can't stop them, can't shut them down. Why? Because the NSA isn't really interested in trying to catch criminals and terrorists who know how to evade the NSA. We proved it with our NSA challenges. They're all about watching you to make sure that you're not planning on doing something the government doesn't approve of. Meanwhile, Senator Chuck Schumer, and we have this on video, and it is linked to the front of whatreallyhappened.com. Senator Chuck Schumer is calling for limits on the First Amendment. And in the video, he's talking about a bill he wants to propose in Congress that would circumvent and bypass the First Amendment. And specifically, what they want to do is have First Amendment rights to freedom of speech confined to the corporate media. That's what they want to do, to basically say the independent media doesn't have a right of free speech anymore. Now, this idea of circumventing or bypassing the First Amendment with a congressional bill is complete and utter nonsense. The only legal, legitimate way to modify or repeal a constitutional amendment is with another constitutional amendment. Good luck getting 3/4 of the states to ratify that one. Of course, based on our experience with the 16th Amendment, they may just lie and say, oh, yeah, it's ratified. Trust us, it's ratified. Got to shut down whatreallyhappened.com and republicbroadcasting.org. You don't have First Amendment protections anymore. One of the reasons they may be very desperate to try and shut down independent media is that, again, as I've said before, the lifespan of a government lie these days can be clocked with an egg timer, and Obama's alarmist climate report has already been debunked by scientists around the world. This was an 840-page White House document that came out and said, if we don't have carbon taxes now, we're all going to die. And these independent scientists basically said this is nonsense. And they used the United Nations reports and the federal government's own data to prove that all the claims made in Obama's report were complete and utter nonsense. And they used the word deception to describe what this document was. They still have ice on Lake Superior, coming up on the 1st of June. Article over at Der Spiegel, basically pointing out that climate scientists are being coerced to toe the line and stay with the dogma of human-caused global warming. And they're talking about Bengtson, who was had been part of the global warming cult. Then he saw the light, saw the truth, went over and joined one of the critical organizations about global warming, and then was subjected to professional and peer group pressure to the point where he had to resign. And Der Spiegel is basically saying this is reminiscent of the persecution of suspected communists in the United States during the era of McCarthyism. You will believe as you are told to believe, or you will lose your career, lose your tenure, lose your funding. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. I'm looking at some of the headlines coming in here. Apparently over in Ukraine, the Kiev forces launched a grenade attack against a truck carrying wounded soldiers. Not exactly compliant with the rules of war, I don't think. All righty, getting on back to the climate report. And this is a story coming out of Washington Times pointing out that the authors of Obama's 800-plus page report on climate alarmism did not come from any kind of an independent group, but from retired military officers and companies that are positioned to profit from the changes being proposed in that report. In other words, a bunch of people got together, said, we're going to write this horror story, and then we'll make money selling them a solution. It was not an objective report. It was being driven by desire for profits here. Meanwhile, there's another story, and this is out of InfoWars. Columbia University apparently got a grant from the National Science Foundation of $5.7 million to produce voicemails that purport to show the horror that waits us all if we don't immediately agree to a carbon tax, including voicemail from 2056, I can't breathe, I love you, mother, you should have changed the world, and just all kinds of pathetic propaganda. This government is desperate to get public acceptance for a carbon tax. They're desperate to get you to forget all about this record-setting winter we just went through, so they can sell human-caused global warming, and it's all the fault of carbon dioxide. They can't even do climate change anymore, because climate change encompasses a lot of different causes. It's all about the carbon tax, so they have to go back to carbon dioxide and the claim that it is warming the planet, which it very clearly is not. And the agenda is in trouble because apparently Ban Ki-moon was planning a climate conference in New York, and to basically try and set up groundwork for the Paris 2015 climate conference, which is supposed to be a follow-on to the Kyoto Protocol. And President Obama is going to be attending, and Francois Hollande will be attending, but German Chancellor Angela Merkel isn't going to bother showing up. And it's a sign that that whole global warming, let's get a carbon tax from everybody agenda is falling apart. Now, here's a very alarming story from naturalnews.com. The White House has now officially admitted to carrying out fake vaccination programs as a cover for covertly stealing DNA samples from the public, supposedly as part of the war on terror. The aim of the scheme, which was carried out all across the Middle East, is to use DNA analysis to identify suspected terrorists, who would then be targeted to be killed by the United States drone strikes. So you can be totally innocent of any crime against the U.S., but targeted for a drone strike because you've got the wrong DNA? That's what they're saying here. That's what they're saying. They're going to use... oh, he's got the wrong... He's got Middle Eastern DNA. Just drone strike him. This seems to be halfway to that research we reported on some time back about new biological weapons being developed that are ethnically sensitive. Will make this group sick, but leave this other group alone. Meanwhile, Merck has issued another mass recall of Gardasil vaccines over glass shard contaminants inside the vials, and I'm sure Ann Coulter will be out there saying, a little glass is good for you. Come on, people. Over in Germany, there is a huge scandal taking place there because the energy utilities have made billions of euros in profits from nuclear power plants, which are now at the end of their lifespan and have to be decommissioned. And it's a very expensive process to dismantle and decommission a used-up nuclear power plant. And now the Germany's three major electric utility companies who have made these billions of euros in profits from the nuclear power plants are now trying to convince the German government that the taxpayers need to pick up the tab for dismantling their nuclear plants so they can keep all their money and transfer the losses to the people. That, again, of course, is what fascism is all about. If you make money, you keep money. If you've got something that's losing money, make the taxpayers cover it all. Another story coming out of Natural News regarding so-called golden rice. This is a genetically modified rice that has a gold color because it's genetically modified to produce higher levels of beta-carotene, which the body will convert to vitamin A. Converting, basically, it's being pitched as preventing blindness and early death. Apparently, actual research into the rice is showing it doesn't really seem to have any benefits for anybody. It's got the color, but all the claims about how it's going to help prevent blindness and extend your life, there doesn't seem to be a scientific basis for any of that. It would be a benefit for people whose diets are deficient in vitamin A. But remember, vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin. You can eat too much of it, and your body can't get rid of it. Same thing with vitamin E. The fat-soluble vitamins, there are upper limits to what you should allow yourself to have, or you can get toxic effects. All righty, there is a story here. This is coming out of CTV News up in Canada, talking about the so-called Windsor hum. We're always seeing that word, the mysterious hum. And the headline says, the hum is real, but the source is unknown. And they're talking about a report from researchers at the University of Windsor and Western University saying that they've confirmed the mysterious low rumble is real, but they have no idea where it's coming from. Well, of course, we know where it's coming from. And the term hum is a misnomer. People who've actually heard it describe it as sounding like a diesel engine, a big diesel engine idling in the distance. And the source has been identified as the sound and vibrations made by giant boring machines that tunnel through the earth, like the ones used to build the Channel Tunnel. Well, these days they're pretty much standard. Remember there was this story about how this tunneling machine made a wrong turn and got destroyed up there in the state of Washington, and nobody's got the money to fix it, and they're just going to abandon the whole project there. But we know the U.S. government has many of these boring machines, and they're digging down into the ground to get for bunkers and tunnels for the coming nuclear war. And they don't want you to know where they're digging these things, and that's why you always get these news stories saying, yeah, they're hearing the sound, but we have no idea what's doing it. And in our link to this story at whatreallyhappened.com, we included a picture of one of these tunnel boring machines owned and operated by the United States Air Force. That's what this mysterious sound is. More police abuse. This is being reported at 12160.info. Apparently, police were pulled over these two women, supposedly for littering, and then proceeded to carry out a body cavity search on these women. because apparently littering is now considered probable cause that they're drug addicts hiding drugs in their private places. And apparently they basically groped the women's breasts and inserted fingers into bodily orifices. And the ADL is proud that they have trained the American police force to act like this. Now, up in the state of New Hampshire, live free or die, and we know the Free State movement is out there trying to basically push back on some of the government's draconian actions. And there was a lawsuit regarding the issue of whether individuals can film police during traffic stops. And the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that, yes, under the First Amendment, yeah, individuals can film police during traffic stops. But then they left in a gigantic loophole saying that police can impose limits on the public's right to film when the circumstances justify them. And he says, especially during traffic stops, which are fraught with dangers to police officers. In other words, they're acknowledging you have a First Amendment right, and then they turn around and say, but yeah, the police can violate that right if they decide the circumstances justify it. We're starting to see a lot of this kind of rulings from the court saying, yes, you have all these rights, but we're going to set them aside because we've got a really good reason to do so. And that's not what the Bill of Rights is about. It's called the Bill of Rights. It's not the Bill of Suggestions. And any government that is not complying with the Bill of Rights is not legal or legitimate. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to take a phone call here. Jerry in Chicago. Aloha, Jerry. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Maybe you can clear two things up for me real quick. You mentioned a U.S. Air Force tunnel boring machine. Could that have been a nuclear-powered tunnel boring machine that might solidify the rock and make a tunnel out of solidified rock?
No, because the noise that it puts out is that of a very large diesel engine, which is what powers these things.
Okay, because, I listened to some talks on YouTube from Phil Schneider years ago that used to work for Army Corps of Engineers with these deep tunnel projects, and he said the U.S. Air Force had at least one nuclear-powered tunnel boring machine.
They might have prototyped one, but, it's an interesting thing about nuclear technology. It's not something that scales down very well. Yes, there are small radioisotope thermoelectric generators like they used on Curiosity and Viking and on certain spy satellites. But to generate that kind of power at that scale, you're really going to be more efficient with some kind of a diesel or gas-powered engine. You don't really get the benefit of nuclear power until you're at the size of a nuclear power plant because of all the machinery involved.
Okay, thanks a lot. I just wanted to ask that one particular item and see what your comments were on it. The other one is about 2 to 3 months ago, I thought I had heard or read something that the Supreme Court came out and said that your rights are not rights, they are privileges, and privileges can be taken away. Is that correct in my assumption?
I recall reading something about that. I think it was a trial balloon, and it drew a huge amount of criticism. I don't think it was an actual ruling. I think it was an opinion. But absolutely, rights are rights, and they cannot be withdrawn at any time. And if the Supreme Court says otherwise, it's an indication that the Supreme Court has delegitimized itself.
Okay, just one more thing that I wanted to add was that remember Obama in his first year, he came out and there was some speech there that he was given or some comment, and he said, let's face it, everybody knows that their rights are given to them by the government.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, man, thanks a lot for taking my call. Keep up the good work. God bless you.
Well, that comment by Obama is basically a reminder that the government is trying to keep control over the American people through enforced dependence on that system. We are enforced to use the fiat currency from the Federal Reserve for all of our commerce. They're trying to shut down small independent farms and ranchers, so we're dependent on the giant food corporations. We're dependent, and dependency is slavery. And so Obama's statement about that betrays that whole agenda. They want everybody dependent on the government. They're still advertising for people to go on to food stamps, even though the budget for food stamps is being cut, which means the individual allocations are plummeting. And we see that out here in Hawaii. The people who are on food stamps, that money runs out third week of every month. But they want you dependent so that you can be controlled. And that's what Obama's statement was really all about. Now, getting on back to the abusive police departments, Counterpunch.org had an interesting article challenging a militarized police state in the U.S., and they basically go down and reprise all of these horrible stories we're getting from, like, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the attacks on legitimate First Amendment-protected protests at Occupy Wall Street, both in New York and in Oakland, and basically expressing concern that despite public outcry about this unconstitutional and often illegal behavior, the police departments are continue to be given all of this weaponry from the Defense Department, armored vehicles, body armor, full-on machine guns. Remember, there was this police department lost a fully automatic M16 the other day. They're being equipped to be a standing army on the streets of America to sort of get around posse comitatus. That's what they're being trained and equipped for. Now, up in Canada, okay, 2 Kodiak RCMP officers shot a Moncton man 4 times last July. And the courts have finally ruled that they are not responsible for his death, even though they shot him 4 times, by saying that he had been stabbed before he was shot, and the stabbing was the cause of death. So even up in Canada, we're seeing the court system protect violent police officers. We're going to take a phone call. Art off the grid. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. That last caller there, talking about rights. Let's not forget 2 very, very important people who deserve our utmost respect. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Note the sense of sarcasm in my tone.
Yes.
First of all, Elena Kagan, when she was going through her confirmation to be Supreme Court Justice, when she stated the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, some of this is pretty clear-cut and is self-explanatory, but much of it needs interpretation, as if to say, shall not be infringed needs interpretation. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty clear, I think. And I was always taught that the Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, the language of the day at that time, was typical of a 6th grade education. Gee, you think they tried to make it simple? And the second quote, during the health care debate, shortly after Obama was elected in 2008, 2009, where they were debating health care, when Harry Reid stood there during a press conference, and he stated, quote, when we in Congress create a right and give it to the people. That should tell you right there what they think of you and me. And anyone who hasn't got this figured out by now is either stupid, retarded, or just plain and simple ain't paying attention.
Now, the Bill of Rights is basically the contract under which we, the people, allow the government to manage the nation. It is not negotiable. And they're trying to convince you that it is with this new Common Core nonsense, assigning kids which 2 amendments of the Bill of Rights would you get rid of. And that's complete nonsense.
Yeah,
we saw about a week ago where Obama is out there saying that it's the Founding Fathers' fault that we have a governmental structure that prevents him from doing what he must do. They're straining at the leash. They understand that they can't keep their scams going if they're following the letter of the law and the Constitution. The function of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution and the laws for the government. And there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says we, the people, have to let the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution for us. It's our Constitution. It says right up at the top, we, the people. It belongs to us, and we have a right to decide for ourselves what it really means, and not succumb to all the weasel wording by all these crooks in Washington, D.C., who want to get rid of the last restraint on their imperial actions.
Well, don't forget, Mike, the United Nations Charter recognizes the right of the people to determine for themselves their own form of government and how they shall live, unless you live in the United States. Hey, Mike, thanks a lot, man. We'll talk to you another time.
All right. Well, we see a lot of countries giving lip service to the Charter of the United Nations, including Israel, and then turning around and openly violating it. But we do, and we don't need the United Nations to tell us this. We all have an inherent right to self-determination, to decide for ourselves whether our current government is doing the job for we the people and the nation, or it's just looting us on behalf of private corrupted interests. And if necessary, to change that government, and if necessary, fire it and start all over. That's in the Declaration of Independence. And everybody in Congress who's out there saying they're not rights, they're just privileges, they are lying to you. And now, of course, we have Senator Chuck Schumer out there trying to sell you the idea that Congress can modify the First Amendment with a legislative vote, and no, they cannot. I got an email from somebody saying that any attempt by Congress to modify the First Amendment might be the spark that triggers a revolution. I certainly hope not. We're going to be back after our top of the hour break. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. Dan, the man, is now in the control room. The phone number is 800-313-9443. We've got callers waiting. But before I get to them, I wanted to comment on that last commercial that we just listened to, the Asia Run Like Hell guide, where they're talking about how medical procedures are just amazingly less expensive in other countries. In fact, you can fly to these other countries, have the procedure, and come back and still spend less than getting the procedure here in the United States. Now, we know the Department of Justice is wrapping up an investigation into auto parts suppliers for price fixing and collusion to agree to overprice their products uniformly, so there's no place to go other than paying the high price. I think it's time that we investigate if that's been going on in the medical industrial complex, because there really is no reason for these medical procedures to be this expensive in the United States of America when they are so much less expensive in all these other countries. I would understand a small uplift. Cost of living is more expensive here. Cost of rent and so forth is more expensive here. But when we're talking about getting a procedure in another country for 10% of what you pay here in the United States of America, something's going on. Are they colluding to fix prices? Probably. We already know they're uplifting their prices to sort of offset the discounts they're forced to give the insurance providers. It's all driven by money. All righty, let's see. Back to the phones. Dan in Oregon. Aloha, Dan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes, Mike, thank you for accepting the call. I just really have one quick question, and I'll hang up and get the answer on the radio. I always have the sneaky feeling that Obama somehow is going to try to, finagle a third term, whether it be by martial law or whatever. Have you noticed any nuances or any statements, written or verbal, that may give an indication perhaps he's thinking in that line? And that's my question, and I'll hang up.
You know something? Every single president in their second and final term starts musing about, oh, how wonderful it would be if I could run for a third term. Of course, that is limited by the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. And the only way to get around that is to repeal that amendment, and the only way to repeal that amendment is with another amendment, and you're going to need 3/4 of the states to ratify that. And at this point, you're going to run into a little bit of a brick wall, because all of those state politicians dream of the White House someday, and it's not going to be made easier by allowing the same president to stay there term after term after term after term after term. They want their chance at it. And so I don't think this is going to go anywhere at all. Now, in the context of declaring a national emergency, suspending the Constitution, and naming himself president for life, that, I think, really would trigger an armed uprising by the American people. So I don't think he's going to try and go and do that. We're going to switch over to Kyle in Philadelphia. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. Well, I wanted to go back to the conversation that we were having about rights in America and some of the statements that these congressmen and senators say. And you have to realize these people are idiots. These are the same people who think that Guam will tip over if there's more than 100,000 people on it. And the only reason why they're in the position that they're in right now is because they have the right last name and they don't know a lot. And so they'll listen to what the lobbyists and the corporations tell them. Mm-hmm. That's not to say that they don't have an agenda, but there's also a big failure on the part of the American people. 200 years ago, the best-selling reading and the best-selling novels weren't, Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey. It was Thomas Paine and his works. And people didn't sit at home and watch TV. They went to the public house and they debated things like rights and where they come from and how government should be run. And I think we've lost a great deal of the sense of responsibility that comes with being an American citizen.
I would disagree. I would disagree because obviously looking at the readership at whatreallyhappened.com and the listenership to Republic Broadcasting, we are the new public house, and we are engaging in debate about what's going on. Now, we don't have the chips and the tankard of ale to go along with that, which may be a good thing. But Americans are getting together on social media and on the independent media and on the blogs, and that's why the NSA spent so much of your tax money to spy on the doings there, just like the British tried to plant spies and informants inside the public houses. And they tried to cut down the Liberty Tree, and of course, they would simply pick another tree and say that's the Liberty Tree now. And so we're seeing a lot of parallels between what's going on now and what was going on in 1776. And certainly my experience over the last 3 to 4 months talking with ordinary people around me in the supermarket and shops and the food distribution programs, they're very much picking up on what's going on. And they've reached the point of being willing to talk about it and say publicly the government is wrong. And so that movement is building to the point where the American people are just going to say it's time to pull the plugs. Now, on the issue of rights, that Bill of Rights, as I said before, is non-negotiable. The federal government is the legal, legitimate government only when it plays by the rules of the Constitution. And the instant it stands up there and exceeds its constitutional authority or dares to tell us the rights don't apply to you any longer, they have delegitimized themselves. And we, the American people, need to start thinking in terms of a government that isn't legitimate ruling this land. Because it isn't. Every new statement coming out of their mouths, like Senator Chuck Schumer saying we have to revise the First Amendment. He's delegitimized himself and the entire Congress with that statement. Kyle, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I thought you had another comment.
Yeah, no, I do. The thought that we need to somehow change the Bill of Rights and the Constitution rather than changing our actions to fit the Bill of Rights and Constitution is a clear sign that there's an issue in, the morality of the people and the government, and that should be, the Holy Bible stuff. That should be things of thou shalt not.
It should be, but our government's getting too big for its britches, and it's decided, hey, the rules shouldn't apply to us. We're the new nobility. We can get away with murder, with drone strikes and everything. The rules, they're just for the serfs and the slaves to have to follow. And
I think you bring up a very important point there. I mean, you look at somebody like Harry Reid, who's been in Congress for over 20 years, and he lives in Washington, and that is his job. It's not supposed to be that way. You're supposed to maintain a job outside of government functions and go to Washington when Congress is in session and then return to your constituents and live amongst them so that you're truly acting in their best interest.
Well, that's certainly how it was set up, when the nation was first created. Being a member of Congress was a part-time honor, and there wasn't a lot of pay associated with it. These were people who knew how to make businesses run. They knew how to build things. They knew how to publish. They knew how to do whatever it was they did. They were connected with the real world and the needs of the real people and the economy. And this permanent ruling class that we've allowed to arise in our midst, as you say, most of them are pretty clueless. There are a few exceptions like Dr. Ron Paul, who went in there with another set of skills. But by and large, most of these politicians really don't know what they're talking about. Al Gore is a good example. He's out there pushing global warming and saying the temperature of the Earth's core is millions of degrees. He's utterly clueless about what he's trying to sell you.
And moreover, it used to be that the decisions and laws that these people made in Congress affected them on a daily basis. If they, if they were in Congress 100 years ago and you wrote a law that we're protecting such and such lands for the dung beetle, then when you went home, you were subject to that law, and your land had to live up to that standard. That's not the way it is today. People make these laws, and they sit up on their high thrones, and they dictate down to the people, and then they go about their own certain lifestyle, never being affected by the laws that they're implementing.
No, plus there's that insider trading advantage, which is all illegal, but, they're there to make money. They're there to become very rich and very powerful, and they're really not concerned with ordinary Americans. You can tell that from the decline of our nation over the last 10 years. We have to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to go back to the phones. David in Boston. Aloha, David. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Quiana, Michael. Yeah. That's like aloha in Yupik Eskimo.
Michael. What was that word again?
Quiana.
Quiana, okay.
With a Q, Quiana. It's just like aloha.
Okay.
They say that up in Alaska, Yupik Eskimo. Hey, have you heard of, Michael, have you heard of the case of Gabriel Diaz, the cab driver with Dominican roots in New York City that was wearing the swastika armband, and the ADL demanded that his taxi cab driver's license be revoked and so on and so forth? Have you heard about that?
Yeah, I heard about it in passing, and I think I would, first of all, want to know why he put that thing on in the first place, but at the same time, it is protected speech under the First Amendment, at least until Chuck Schumer gets done with the First Amendment. And, of course, we always know that anybody who does anything involving swastika or Nazis, they're setting themselves up a target for the ADL and AIPAC and this hysterical preserve the orthodoxy at all costs machinery that is rampant across the nation.
Yeah, you know what I find ironic, Michael, is, I was going to talk about these statues of the Virgin Mary and these stars of David dangling from the rearview mirror and all this, but before I moved to Alaska, driving cab up in Alaska, during the 70s, I drove in New York City, Michael. Mm-hmm. And there was I don't know if it's still there, but there was a notorious homosexual S&M, sadomasochistic bar, ironically enough, in the meatpacking district, called the Mine Shaft.
Okay. I heard about that. Yeah. Never been there. I'm not into that scene. Pain hurts. I'm not interested in that kind of stuff. But
it was absolutely sickening. This is a family show. I couldn't even tell you about it. But
I would prefer that you don't do that here.
Other than to say, Michael, we used to have to drive. People used to get in my cab in full Nazi regalia. These sadomasochistic homosexuals, and I'd have to take them to the mine shaft. And, and they were in full Nazi regalia and everything. And as far as I know, we weren't allowed to refuse them service. And some of them are even recognized as being New York City officials. Dressed, and they'd have fake Hitler mustaches on. And
okay, now, hang on here a second. We've got a little bit of a schism between the stories. I understand that for certain scenes and parties, Nazi regalia is just part of the costuming. I mean, Prince Harry was in a Nazi costume for some event that he was going to. Was this New York City cab driver wearing a Nazi armband just to wear a Nazi armband? It seems to me like we're comparing apples and oranges.
Evidently he believes in National Socialism as a form of government, but he insists he's not anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic or anything. He just believes in. He says he doesn't believe in international socialism. Which would probably be okay with the ADL communism, but he's a fervent believer in National Socialism just as a form of government.
Well, I don't know. I got to tell you, I have to wonder about this guy. First of all, the Nazis lost the war, and I don't think anybody really wants to emulate them anymore. In fact, as we look at the beginnings of new nationalist socialism across Europe, they're not putting on Nazi regalia. They're coming up with new symbols. They want to de-link from the negative connotations of the Nazis. And so I think this guy maybe was trying to attract some attention, or maybe even the ADL put him up to it so they could make a big stink about it. because we know the ADL has done that before. Anyway, listen, thank you for the phone call. We're going to let you go here. I want to get back to some police brutality stories here before we run out of the show. Apparently, up in Michigan, their prosecutor has called for the firing of a state trooper who pulled over an 18-year-old woman on a traffic violation and felt it was necessary to pull his gun on her. That is definitely inappropriate. That gun should not come out of the holster unless the officer is convinced he is in threat of his life and safety, and I don't think an 18-year-old hottie in a fast car qualifies. Meanwhile, down in San Diego, apparently $1 million in cash has gone missing from their offices. So I would start looking at those San Diego police officers and see if any of them are driving new, hot, fast cars. Now, apparently, there's a big stink. This is reported at 12160.info. And apparently, there was this incident where this journalist posted some public records on his blog to make a point. The Attorney General of the state came in and ordered the journalist to remove these public records from his blog, which the Attorney General does not have authority to do that in any of the 50 states, with the inevitable result that the records were immediately posted all over the Internet. And that's a new reality that the government has to be aware of. Once it's on the net, you don't get to take it back. And these were public records. And we, the people, have a right to use those public records to underscore that corruption is taking place, that bad decision-making is taking place, that we are being lied to about things like Saddam's nuclear weapons and human-caused global warming. We have a right to do that, and that is protected by the First Amendment. It's probably why Chuck Schumer wants to take a meat axe to it. Now then, story coming out of CNN. As you're probably aware, the Apple devices now have this system where you can, if you're going through their iCloud, remotely lock and disable and even erase a stolen iPhone. Well, apparently that isn't a guarantee any longer. Hackers have figured out a way to completely reset the phone and, start it up again and sell it. So they're putting all the security on there. We pay for it, and it turns out to not do what it's supposed to do. What do these locking features allow the government to do? Shut down all the iPhones and digital cameras that are Wi-Fi enabled and tablets that are around something going on the government doesn't want anybody to see. And I think the next step we're going to see will be that police cars are going to be outfitted with special jammers that are designed to disable cell phone cameras, tablet cameras, digital cameras that have Wi-Fi capability built into them. So if you're going to some kind of a protest, dig out that old digital pocket camera that doesn't have a Wi-Fi connection and take that along, because that one is currently jam-proof. Now, Tennessee, facing a shortage of the drugs used for lethal injection, has decided to bring back the electric chair. And again, I have a problem with all death penalty cases because we know there's a great deal of fraud and corruption in the prosecution. We know that innocent people are sent to jail. Innocent people are sent to their deaths. It's estimated 5% of the people being executed in this country are innocent of the crime they're executed for. We had another story that came out. After 27 years on death row, they had to let a guy go. Turned out the prosecution had suppressed evidence that exonerated him. Happens all the time. And until we can restore life to those it is wrongfully taken from, we shouldn't take it in the first place. And I know I make a lot of jokes about tarring and feathering of bankers and yeehaw Iran for hanging their crooked bankers. But in all honesty, I can't support the death penalty. What if you get it wrong? And they do get it wrong. And we know this government, they won't admit that they're wrong. They're still trying to claim that Bruno Richard Hauptmann deserved what he got for the Lindbergh kidnapping. All right, we got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And over this last weekend, we had the March Against Monsanto. Was all over the world. They did have a pretty sizable turnout. We had two They were more sign wavings than marches here on the island of Oahu. Unfortunately, we spent most of the weekend under some major thunderstorms. But it does seem to indicate that public opinion has turned against this disastrous experiment with genetically modified organisms. And people are very concerned about the growing number of reports of physical harm and illness caused by these products. Monsanto, of course, is using their incredible political, financial, and lobbying clout to create a country in which we're not going to be told that the food we eat is not natural, that it's artificially produced. Even the USDA, which has their little certified organic emblem that people have been looking for to avoid GMO, they just revised their rules to say, well, a certain percentage of GMO is now acceptable. So even that logo is not a guarantee. We know states like Vermont have passed mandatory GMO labeling. We know that Monsanto is trying to lobby a federal law to make it illegal to tell people when they are eating GMO. This is all driven by desire for profit with zero concern about potential harm to the public. But they're losing the war in the court of public opinion, just like the fracking people are losing the war. Now, there was a little bit of an hysterical article. This came out of Natural News talking about how nearly 1/4 of the honeybees died over the winter. And this is an unsustainable rate. Now, yes, colony collapse disorder is a major problem. We've already reached the point where beehives are being trucked from farm to farm to farm to try and achieve the pollinization needed to keep growing plants naturally and organically. We know that GMO pollen harms benign insect species. There was a study published in the journal Nature some years ago which showed GMO pollen was what was killing off the monarch butterflies. But with regard to the idea that 1/4 of the bees died over the winter, I think this article was written by somebody who doesn't really understand bees, because during the winter, the drones are ejected from the hive to conserve food. That's part of the natural bee process. The male drones are simply kicked out. So the hive's population is going to drop, and then the following spring, when there are plenty of flowers and pollen to feed them, new males are created. So we have to be very, very careful about what's going on. Story over in Blacklisted News. Scientists are creating new incurable diseases in the labs. Not exactly sure why. Certainly there's a lot of biological weapons research. We have to wonder if they are so desperate to sell us new cures, they're going to come up with new diseases. And it wouldn't be the first time. I remember reading about a case, and this happened back in the early 1900s, where this county arrested and jailed 3 doctors for intentionally starting a flu epidemic in their county in order to have patients come in and spend money to get cured. So it has happened before. Now, this story is focusing, of course, on the swine flu, H1N1, that had been gone for 20 years, and all of a sudden it reemerged in 1977. Same strain from the 1950s, like it had been frozen in a laboratory somewhere. And basically, it eventually came out that the late 70s flu outbreak likely resulted from a lowly lab worker's snafu. They dropped a test tube, which can happen. Or some executive took a test tube and threw it out in the parking lot to boost vaccine sales, because it's all driven by the money. And concern for the health of the American people is simply not a priority. In fact, a healthy America is bad for business. If you are all healthy, you're watching your nutrition, you're availing yourself of alternative cures, that whole medical industrial complex would collapse. They can't stand the idea that you might actually be healthy, or that you're using colloidal silver, or that you're able to treat gout with alkaline water. Their business model can't tolerate that. By the way, another story coming out of Activist Post. Apparently there has been for quite some time a genetically engineered HIV vaccine A new study published in Lancet reveals that this vaccine manufactured by Merck actually increased the chances that you would contract HIV. Let me run that by you one more time. Merck came out with this genetically engineered HIV vaccine, supposedly to protect you from that disease, and people who got the vaccine were more likely to come down with HIV. It's like this mumps outbreak in New York, where they're out there saying 90% of the people who got the mumps had the vaccine. At the very least, it's not working, if not outright causing these illnesses. Now remember, the bill that created the Department of Homeland Security included a rider permanently indemnifying vaccine manufacturers from lawsuits arising from bad product. They have absolutely no incentive to worry that much about the safety and efficacy of their products. It's just whatever they can convince you to pump into your arm, that's what they're going to sell you. Now, Dakota Dunes-based Beef Products Incorporated has sued ABC News for $1.2 billion over the ABC network calling their the lean, finely textured beef product pink slime. And I don't think it actually originated with ABC. It's just anybody who saw a photo of it, that's what it looks like. And BPI is alleging that public rejection of the pink slime led to a loss of business, plant closings, and layoffs because people were not were concerned about whether the product was safe or not. And they're using as their argument in the lawsuit, the FDA has deemed the product safe to eat, which doesn't mean a darn thing in this day and age. And there are reasons. Looking at this lean, finely textured beef, there's a lot of chemicals used in that process. And ultimately, it is the right of the people to know whether what they're putting in their mouth or shooting into their bloodstream is safe. And people have a right to choose for themselves what products they will avail themselves on. If we're a free people, we can decide what we want to eat, what medications we want. And commerce should remember that old axiom, the customer is always right, and say, if this is what the people want to buy, let's sell it to them. Instead of the current attitude of, this is what we want to sell to make the most money, and we will force the public to buy it. Good example would be monosodium glutamate. A lot of people do not want monosodium glutamate. It causes a lot of symptoms in people. In myself, it's a migraine trigger. And reading those labels, trying to avoid monosodium glutamate is very hard because they've got about 30 different euphemistic names that they put in there to try and conceal the fact that what they're talking about is monosodium glutamate. Hydrolyzed soy protein. In one infamous case here, it was simply called enzymes. They don't want you to know. And every time a food additive is proven to be harmful, they'll rename it so they can go on selling it. High fructose corn syrup, they want to rename it corn sugar. Aspartame, they want to rename it amino sweet. They don't want to fix the problem. They don't want to stop using a harmful product. They just want to go on selling what they've been selling in order to make more money and lie to you, the American public, to get you to go along. And at some point, I would hope that all of America would stand up and say, I will not be lied to anymore. When you lie to me, that's the end of it. I don't listen to you anymore. I don't buy your product. I don't obey your orders. I don't pay your bills. I don't send my kids to die in your wars. I will not live with a government that lies to us. Period. End of discussion. Better no government at all than a government that's lying to us. So, all right, we're coming up on another break here. And when we come back, a little bit of news from the world of science and some new developments coming in from Ukraine as well. So we're going to take a break here. I got about 10 seconds to fill until the music starts showing up here. And so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It was an awkward pause. I didn't have something I could fit in there. Anyway, here's the music. We'll be back soon. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of our program here today on this Tuesday. And I spotted this story a while back in Daily Mail. And the headline is this proof that life once flourished on Mars? Clay-like mineral found on the red planet can be created by microbes. And they're talking about this mineral stevensite, which is actually used in a lot of cosmetics, all the way back to ancient Egypt. And scientists have discovered that this mineral on Earth is created by microbial activity. Before it had been thought it's just sedimentary whatever. Now they're realizing it is a waste product from these organisms, and they have identified the exact same mineral on the planet Mars. Now, of course, on the 13th of June, Dr. Gilbert Levin will be our on-air guest talking about the Viking life sciences and some of the weird behavior we're getting out of the people running Curiosity. And Dr. Levin is of the opinion these strange little blueberries, these spheres that are found all over the surface of Mars, may well be the remains of bacterial colonies that form crusts around themselves. And we have bacterial colonies that do that right here on Earth. Now, the official NASA declaration is they're hematite. They were formed by running water. Never a straight answer. Now, then there was this other weird story that came out in Russia Today, where NASA made an announcement that Curiosity may have transported Earth bacteria to Mars. Now, that's not without foundation. After Viking was declared to have found a lifeless Mars, NASA pulled back on the sterilization procedures for all subsequent Mars rovers and landers. Now, Curiosity, because it was going to sort of re-verify the life sciences results from Viking, went through a sterilization, mostly a chemical wipe down. But this new study indicated there are 377 strains of bacteria that could survive the sterilization process used on Curiosity and have survived the trip from Earth to Mars. They're really rugged little critters here. And I think what's going on here, remember after Curiosity landed, it had been there for about 2 weeks, and we were getting all these rumors of a tremendous discovery that was going to change the science textbooks, to be announced next week. 1 week later, nothing. It simply vanished. Now, I think we're being given the Marco Polo treatment. And by that I mean when Marco Polo first returned from the Far East, the ruling class in Europe, especially the church, were absolutely terrified of what was going to happen to their society when they learned there was this amazing advanced culture far to the east that didn't even know about Jesus or church rule. And so after Marco Polo got back to Europe, he was not only ridiculed and smeared, he was thrown in prison by the Dominicans to keep word of what he'd found from leaking out of fear that it would transform society, change people's perceptions and priorities to a point that couldn't be controlled. And I have to wonder if the same attitude has pervaded the U.S. government and NASA, because the labeled release experiment that Dr. Levin designed on Viking showed a positive result indicating microbial activity in the soil. But NASA went with the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer result, which said no organic molecules, to say there's no life there. We know now that the high content of perchlorates in the Martian soil would have prevented the GCMS from ever returning a positive result. It was a false negative. But NASA to this day still maintains, ignore LRE, GCMS tells us there's no life on Mars. So now we have this strange thing about a science book rewriting discovery on Mars that went away, and now they're hemming and hawing and saying, well, there was life on Mars at one point because of this mineral we've discovered, but if we find life there now, it's been brought from Earth. And I think that what's going on is our present government is very concerned that if there were confirmation of alien life on other worlds, it would change the perceptions of all humanity and take it in directions that are not suitable to the private central bankers and the warmongers. If we found out for an absolute fact there's life out there on other worlds, we might say, I want to put down the guns and the bombs. Let's find out who else is out there. Can't imagine why they would want to come bother visiting us. Apologies to Stephen Hawking. But it might change our core values, perceptions, and beliefs to a degree that it would make it far more difficult for the current regimes around the world to keep us under control. And so I think what's happening is NASA's looking for a way to say that, yes, we got a positive result for life on the Curiosity rover, but it probably just hitchhiked from Earth. And it's the kind of never a straight answer behavior that we've gotten from NASA all through these years. I remember my science fair project in high school regarding tektites, and I concluded tektites did not come from the moon because they contained far more water than NASA said the returned moon rocks from Apollo did. Then we find out years later the Apollo moon rocks were found to contain water, and NASA said, oh, no, we know the moon is dry. It must be a lab contaminant. And they changed the final report to say lunar rocks are completely anhydrous. And now subsequent spacecraft have confirmed that fine crystalline lattice is able to hold water, liquid water, through capillary action against the vacuum of space. We have seen so many calamities that come about from politicians who think politics ought to trump science, human-caused global warming being the most severe embarrassment so far. And I know I get a lot of emails saying, you're attacking science when you attack global warming. No, I'm attacking the politicalization of science. And we're still seeing it. We're still seeing a government convinced that they can lie to us about everything and get away with it, and no, they can't any longer. All right, a couple of headlines before we end the show. Will summer gas prices crush the consumer? Of course, we know that it's traditional during summer and people want to do driving tours and trips, gas prices will go up. But there's an interesting statistic. Apparently, since the crash of 2008, gasoline usage by the American consumer has dropped by more than half. And I'm sure a large part of that has to do with people who are no longer driving to work every single day. But it obviously indicates also a plummet in gas tax revenues, which is why now they're out there talking about a per-mile tax on people. The whole system's shutting down. Retail-mageddon. Over in the European Union, they're now trying to spin the defeat of the globalists in the EU elections as somehow the fault of Russia. You know, that these parties that want to get away from the European Union, they long to be tied to Russia. And maybe they do. Russia's got a solid economy. But they're just trying to spin their defeat away to say it's got no, the European people still believe in the European Union and the European Central Bank. It's somebody else's fault. I'm already seeing articles come out in response to Chuck Schumer's claiming that the Senate can pass a bill to modify the First Amendment, and no, we can't. That Bill of Rights is non-negotiable, and any government not complying with that Bill of Rights is not legitimate. It is not legal. And we, the American people, have to stand firm on that. Or the next generation is going to inherit a dictatorship. The very kind of dictatorship the Founding Fathers tried to avoid with that Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Another article, this is coming over from wakeupfromyourslumber.com. The rapprochement between Russia and China, dangerous for the dollar. We've been saying exactly the same thing. Apparently here in the United States of America, and this is reported at Patriots Rising, the median pay for a corporate CEO has just crossed $10 million per year. So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting laid off. Activists are in the Baltimore area are calling for a change to the city's police department's taser policy. Apparently over in Baltimore, the attitude seems to be tase first and ask questions later. And apparently this follows the death of George King, 19-year-old, who was hit with a taser by officers inside of the MedStar Good Samaritan Hospital and died. Remember, we had a cardiac expert on the show who said if that taser jolt hits you at the right point in the heart cycle, your heart will stop. These are not non-lethal. There's the music. It's time for me to get out of here and get some errands done with the rest of the day. We will be back tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, stay skeptical, make good choices. Please donate to Republic Broadcasting. I cannot tell you how important it is that you keep us on the air. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.